White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt has been a vocal defender of President Trump's tariff policy, particularly in response to escalating trade tensions and the administration's broader economic agenda. Key points from Leavitt's response: tariffs as non-negotiable and a national emergency. Leavitt has stated that the tariffs imposed by President Trump are not a negotiation, but a response to what the administration considers a national emergency. She emphasized that for decades, foreign countries have ripped off American workers and taken jobs overseas, and that the president is now putting an end to this practice. Tariffs framed as beneficial to Americans. In press briefings, Leavitt has argued that tariffs are not a tax hike on Americans, but rather a tax on foreign countries that have been ripping us off. She claims tariffs are, in effect, a tax cut for the American people, aligning with the administration's broader push for tax cuts and economic nationalism. Economic and manufacturing justification. Leavitt has positioned the tariffs as a tool to restore American manufacturing, increase wages, and keep revenues within the country. She invoked the decline of American small towns and industries as evidence of the need for a more protectionist trade policy, aiming to make the U.S. a manufacturing superpower once again. Reciprocal and baseline tariffs. The new tariff regime includes a baseline 10% tariff on all imports, with higher reciprocal tariffs for countries deemed worst offenders, for example, China, and the EU face tariffs matching half their own rates on U.S. goods. There is also a specific 25% tariff on foreign automobiles. Response to criticism and market reaction. When pressed on concerns about consumer costs and market downturns, Leavitt maintained that the policy would ultimately benefit American workers and the economy, urging Wall Street to trust in President Trump. She highlighted the anticipated massive revenue from tariffs and the administration's commitment to further tax cuts, negotiations, and global response. Despite the hardline stance, Leavitt noted that the administration is open to negotiations, as evidenced by nearly 50 countries seeking trade deals following the announcement of the new tariffs. However, she reiterated that the 10% baseline tariff is set to remain in effect during ongoing negotiations. Karoline Leavitt's response to tariffs is characterized by a strong defense of protectionist trade measures, framing them as essential for American economic renewal and national security. She consistently argues that tariffs target foreign countries, not American consumers, and are part of a broader strategy to revitalize U.S. industry and secure better trade terms globally. Karoline Leavitt defends tariffs using several main arguments centered on economic nationalism, protection of domestic industries, and strategic negotiation leverage. Tariffs protect American jobs and industries. Leavitt argues that tariffs are necessary to protect domestic industries, including manufacturing and agriculture, from unfair foreign competition. She claims that without tariffs, American workers and farmers would lose out to countries that use subsidies, currency manipulation, or lower labor and environmental standards, which create an uneven playing field. Tariffs are not a tax on Americans, but a tax on foreign countries. She insists that tariffs are a tax hike on foreign countries that have been ripping off the U.S. It's not on American consumers. Leavitt controversially describes tariffs as effectively a tax cut for the American people, asserting that the revenue generated will stay in the U.S., raise wages, and contribute to making the country wealthy again. Tariffs as a strategic negotiation tool. Leavitt frames tariffs as part of President Trump's art of the deal strategy, a bargaining chip to pressure other countries into fairer trade practices and better deals for the U.S. She emphasizes that the president is an incessant negotiator, using tariffs to bring other countries to the table and protect American interests, long-term economic benefits despite short-term pain, while acknowledging some short-term difficulties, especially for farmers. Leavitt argues that tariffs will lead to long-term gains by revitalizing American manufacturing, creating jobs, and restoring economic strength lost over decades due to offshoring and unfair trade. Tariffs will enable further tax cuts and economic growth. Leavitt claims that the revenue from tariffs will provide the government with funds that can be used for additional tax cuts, benefiting Americans financially and stimulating the economy. In summary, Karoline Leavitt's defense of tariffs rests on the belief that they protect American jobs and industries from unfair foreign competition, serve as a powerful negotiation tool, generate revenue that benefits the U.S. economy, and ultimately restore American economic strength and manufacturing dominance. How Karoline Leavitt addresses criticism that tariffs lead to higher consumer prices. Karoline Leavitt, as White House press secretary, has consistently pushed back against the criticism that tariffs result in higher prices for American consumers. Her main arguments and responses are as follows. Tariffs as a tax cut for Americans. Leavitt asserts that tariffs are not a tax on Americans, but rather a tax cut for the American people. She claims that tariffs target foreign countries and are designed to keep revenue in the U.S., raise wages, and ultimately make the country wealthier. This framing is intended to counter the widespread economic consensus that tariffs function as a tax on imported goods, which is typically passed on to consumers through higher prices. Focus on long-term economic gains. In response to direct questions about consumer costs, Leavitt emphasizes the broader economic benefits she expects from tariffs, such as fairer trade, job creation, and increased domestic wages. She argues that when the U.S. achieves fair and balanced trade, the resulting economic growth will outweigh any short-term price increases. Deflection from immediate price impact. When pressed on whether tariffs raise prices for consumers, Leavitt has called such questions insulting and redirects the conversation to the administration's broader economic agenda, including job growth and wage increases. She does not directly acknowledge that tariffs are paid by importers and often passed on to consumers. Historical reference to first-term policies. Leavitt points to the previous Trump administration's record, claiming that tariffs, combined with tax cuts and deregulation, led to job and wage growth with no inflation, suggesting that similar results can be achieved again. Criticism and economic consensus. Despite Leavitt's arguments, economists almost universally agree that tariffs act as a tax on consumers, with the costs largely passed down through higher prices on imported goods. Analyses of previous tariff rounds showed that American businesses and households bore most of the financial burden. Leavitt's framing is widely disputed by experts, who argue that her statements reflect a misunderstanding of how tariffs function in practice. Karoline Leavitt addresses concerns about the negative effects of tariffs on the stock market by emphasizing optimism and downplaying the immediate market downturns caused by tariff announcements. Her main points include encouraging trust in the president's economic strategy. Leavitt calls on Wall Street and investors to trust President Trump's approach, framing tariffs as part of a broader plan to correct decades of unfair trade practices and ultimately benefit American workers and the economy. She stresses that the president is diligently working to implement a successful economic strategy, including tariffs, tax cuts, and deregulation, downplaying market volatility as temporary. Despite significant stock market declines following tariff announcements such as the S&P 500 dropping more than 9% in 3 weeks, and major indices falling sharply after Liberation Day, Tariffs Leavitt insists these are short-term reactions. She urges patience and confidence that the long-term effects will be positive, highlighting that the tariffs are intended to revitalize manufacturing jobs and protect American industries, rejecting the idea that tariffs will cause economic pain. Leavitt asserts that tariffs will not cause pain for American workers or businesses, instead promising job returns and economic gains. She links tariff revenue to enabling further tax cuts, which she claims will offset inflationary pressures and support consumer finances. Framing tariffs as a negotiation tool and part of a larger deal, Leavitt portrays tariffs as a strategic bargaining chip in ongoing trade negotiations, suggesting that the administration's art of the deal approach will lead to better trade terms and economic benefits that will eventually stabilize markets. Acknowledging consumer and market concerns but urging patience, while recognizing that consumer worries and market volatility are legitimate. Leavitt urges the public and investors to remain patient and trust the administration, plan to safeguard future economic generations. In summary, Karoline Leavitt addresses the potential negative effects of tariffs on the stock market by urging confidence in the president's economic plan, framing market declines as temporary and necessary steps toward long-term economic revitalization, and rejecting the notion that tariffs will cause lasting harm to American workers or businesses. Specific examples Karoline Leavitt uses to support the benefits of tariffs. Karoline Leavitt, as White House press secretary, has repeatedly defended tariffs by making broad claims about their benefits. However, her support relies more on general assertions than on concrete, specific examples. The main points and examples she uses are tariffs as a tax cut for Americans. Leavitt claims that tariffs function as a tax cut for the American people. She argues that by imposing tariffs, revenue stays in the U.S., wages go up, and the country becomes wealthier. This is presented as a direct benefit, although she does not cite specific data or case studies to support the claim. Historical reference to Trump's first term. Leavitt points to President Trump's first term, asserting that the combination of tariffs, tax cuts, deregulation, and increased domestic energy production led to historic job, wage, and investment growth with no inflation. This is used as an example of how tariffs, as part of a broader policy mix, allegedly benefited the U.S. economy. However, she does not break down these results to isolate the impact of tariffs specifically. General promises of economic improvement. She frequently states that with fair and balanced trade, which she claims tariffs will help achieve, revenues will stay here, wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. These are broad promises rather than specific, measurable examples. Negotiating leverage. Leavitt and other administration officials argue that tariffs serve as a negotiating tool to secure better trade deals, which could, in theory, boost domestic industrial production and economic growth. However, this is a strategic rationale rather than a specific realized example of benefit. Main arguments economists use to counter Leavitt's claim about tariffs. Economists overwhelmingly reject Karoline Leavitt's assertion that tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. Their counter-arguments are grounded in standard economic theory, empirical research, and decades of professional consensus. The main points include: tariffs function as a tax on consumers, not a tax cut. Economists universally agree that tariffs are taxes imposed on imported goods. The cost of these tariffs is typically paid by the importing company, which then passes the added expense on to consumers through higher prices. This means that rather than reducing taxes, tariffs effectively increase the cost of goods for American households, functioning as a tax hike rather than a tax cut. Empirical evidence shows consumers bear the cost. Multiple studies of previous tariff rounds, including those implemented during Trump's first term, found that the majority of tariff costs were borne by American consumers, not foreign exporters. This results in higher prices for everyday goods and a reduction in consumer purchasing power. Tariffs reduce economic welfare. Surveys of professional economists consistently show near unanimous agreement, 94% to 95%, over several decades, that tariffs and import quotas reduce general economic welfare. This is because tariffs distort market prices, reduce trade efficiency, and ultimately harm economic growth. Tariff revenue cannot meaningfully replace other taxes. While some supporters argue that tariff revenue could offset other taxes, economists point out that even extremely high tariffs would not generate enough revenue to replace income taxes or significantly lower the overall tax burden for most Americans. Attempting to do so would also severely curtail imports, further damaging the economy. Tariffs are regressive. Economists note that tariffs disproportionately impact lower-income Americans, who spend a larger share of their income on goods subject to tariffs. This makes tariffs a regressive form of taxation, increasing inequality rather than alleviating it. No direct pathway from tariffs to wage growth or prosperity. There is no direct evidence that tariffs lead to higher wages or broad-based prosperity. Instead, the consensus is that tariffs raise costs, disrupt supply chains, and can lead to retaliation from trading partners, further harming domestic industries and workers. In conclusion, economists counter Leavitt's claims by demonstrating that tariffs are a tax on consumers, raise prices, reduce economic welfare, and cannot meaningfully replace other taxes. The overwhelming consensus is that tariffs are a tax hike, not a tax cut, and their costs are largely borne by American households. According to Karoline Leavitt, the potential benefits of tariffs include protection of domestic industries. Tariffs help shield American industries, such as manufacturing and agriculture, from unfair foreign competition, including practices like subsidies and currency manipulation by other countries. This protection is seen as essential to preserving American jobs and industries that might otherwise be lost to cheaper imports. Job creation in certain sectors. Leavitt argues that tariffs can lead to the creation of new jobs in specific sectors by encouraging domestic production and reducing reliance on foreign goods. Long-term economic strengthening. While acknowledging short-term challenges, especially for farmers, Leavitt believes tariffs will strengthen the American economy in the long run by revitalizing manufacturing and other key industries. Revenue generation for the U.S. Treasury. Tariffs generate significant revenue for the federal government, which Leavitt and the administration suggests could help fund tax cuts and other economic initiatives, effectively benefiting American workers and consumers. Encouragement to buy American. Tariffs are intended to incentivize consumers and businesses to purchase domestically produced goods, which supports American manufacturers and workers. Strategic negotiation tool. Tariffs serve as leverage in trade negotiations, pressuring other countries to change unfair trade practices and agree to better deals that benefit the U.S. economy and workers. Revitalization of American manufacturing. Leavitt highlights the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs over decades and presents tariffs as a key part of a plan to bring these jobs back to the U.S., restoring economic prosperity in affected regions. In summary, Leavitt frames tariffs as a multifaceted tool that protects American jobs and industries, creates employment opportunities, strengthens the economy over time, generates government revenue, promotes domestic consumption, and serves as a bargaining chip in international trade negotiations.